Hello and welcome to Wool & Works. Today we're going to be learning how to do the garter, stockinette and rib stitch. If you haven't already, go and watch my knit and purl tutorial as we'll be using those stitches today. This jumper here is the very first one I ever made, and it uses the stockinette stitch in the body and then the rib stitch on the cuffs of the sleeves. So you can make some really cool items with these few stitches that we're going to learn today. Here's a scarf that I made a few years ago, and you can see I've got all three stitches that we're going to be learning today. So this bottom one here is the garter stitch, then we've got stockinette and a 2x2 rib stitch. So I'll be showing you how to do the 1x1 and the 2x2 rib, and then you can change it up how you like. You could make this 7 stitches and this part 5, whatever you like to do. So they are the 3 stitches that we'll be learning today and what they look like. So to start, we'll do the garter stitch, and I've done a few rows here with 10 stitches just to show you what it looks like. And the garter stitch is simply just knitting forwards and then knitting the next row. So you knit every single row. So insert your needle, wrap the yarn, slide up and off, and you'll do that for every single stitch. And the only thing you kind of need to worry about with this one is that your yarn is coming from the back of your needle when you're knitting. So when we knit, we want it to always come from the back. So we don't want, for example, our yarn to be here, sitting at the front or on top of our needle and then knit, because that will increase our stitches. So always make sure knitting it's at the back, and you simply knit to the end. And then to do the next row, you just turn around and knit back. So knit the last stitch here, and then put the needle with the stitches into your left hand and the empty needle into your right hand, and then you just knit back again. So insert your needle, wrap the yarn and knit. So the garter stitch is probably one of the more common stitches, but it's quite easy to do, and I'll show you my scarf again. So I did the garter stitch at the end of this scarf and then did some tassels, but the reason I did the garter stitch here was because it actually can help stop your pieces from rolling up. So if you do the stockinette stitch on the end, sometimes what can happen is it can kind of roll like this, and so if we do just a couple rows of the garter stitch, it just stops that from happening. So if you're finding you're doing stockinette stitch and it's rolling, it's not the way you're doing anything wrong. It's just that can sometimes happen because purl stitches can be tighter than our knit stitches. So if you knit a couple rows of garter at the start and then do your stockinette, you'll stop that rolling. This stitch here is the stockinette stitch. So you can see the right side is quite flat, and when we flip it over, it's got those bumps kind of similar to the garter stitch but a bit tighter together. So this is what your wrong side would look like, and this is your right side. And when we do this stitch, we knit a row and then we purl a row. So when you're looking at your right side, you'll be knitting, and when you're looking at your wrong side, you'll be purling, because the purl stitch creates bumps at the front of the stitch. So I've already cast on a few rows of stockinette stitch here, and I've done it without anything, any garter stitch or anything at the bottom, because I wanted to show you what happens. So sometimes you might find in your projects the stockinette stitch will roll and do something like this. Now that's not you, it's simply because the purl stitch is a bit tighter than the knit stitch, and so when you're doing this one, it just naturally wants to roll up. So to prevent that, similar to what I did on the scarf, you want to do a few rows of garter stitch, then do your stockinette stitch, and that'll prevent that rolling from happening. So to do the stockinette stitch, as I said, we knit on the right side and then we purl on the wrong side. So here I'm going to do a knit stitch, and we're going to knit the whole way across. So last stitch here, and to turn around, put the needle with the stitches in your left hand, the empty needle in your right, and to go back we're going to purl. So we insert the needle and wrap the yarn. Now remember, when we're doing the purl stitch, the yarn has to come from the front or on top of the needle, so we don't want to be wrapping it around the back like this. Bring it to the front and then wrap. And you purl all the way across, just making sure that that yarn is coming from the top of your piece. And purl the last stitch. So for the stockinette stitch, you're going to knit one row and then purl back. And you're knitting always on the side that's nice and flat and purling on this bumpy side. So if you ever get lost or can't remember if you've just done a knit or a purl row, just remember when you're looking at the right side, which is the one with the V-like stitches, that's your knit side, and the bumpy one is your purl side. Next we're going to learn the rib stitch. So you can see here I've got a small swatch of 1 by 1 rib stitch. So we've got one column of these V-like stitches here. And in my scarf, you can see this one's a bit wider. It does use chunky wool, but we've got 2 columns of those V-like stitches, then the gap, then another 2. So this was a 2 by 2 rib stitch. And if I lay this out nice and flat, you can see that it kind of cinches the scarf in. And so the rib stitch is often used on cuffs. So here I've got some fingerless mittens and I've used it on the cuffs to kind of bring it around the wrist. And same for this mitten. So it just brings your knitting in. So you'll often see this maybe around the bottom of jumpers, but yeah, on sleeves or even a neckline of some tops. So to do the rib stitch, it's best, I find, if you have an even number of stitches. It just means that every row always starts with a knit stitch, but it depends on, you know, what your pattern says. If it does have an odd number, don't worry, because I'll be showing you how to understand where you are in your pattern so that you don't get lost. So remember, the knit stitches are flat on the front, whereas the purls create this bump. So every time you see this bump at the front, you want to be purling that stitch. So we're going to go knit, purl, knit, purl, knit, purl, all the way to the end. So for this first stitch that we're knitting, insert your needle, wrap the yarn up and off. Now to do a purl stitch, remember the working yarn has to be at the front of our needle. So to do that, simply take the yarn, bring it between our 2 needles so that it's at the front, then we insert, wrap, and slide off. To knit, take the working yarn, put it to the back, then insert your needle. So it's really important that the working yarn is in the correct position before you insert your needle. If you do it afterwards, you'll end up accidentally increasing your stitches. So you take the yarn, put it to the back, then insert and knit the stitch. To purl, bring it to the front, then insert, and you'll do that moving the yarn back and forth for each stitch all the way to the end of your row. And then to go back the other way, flip over, and remember we're going to start with a knit because this next stitch has a bump, and we always purl the ones that have the bump on the front. So knit, purl, all the way across. Now if you're wanting to do something a bit thicker, so like this 2 by 2 rib stitch, all you do for that is knit 2, purl 2, knit 2, purl 2. So you can really experiment with how you want your rib stitch to look. You could make these flat columns a lot wider, so you can make this whole section knitted, and then purl 2 in this small part, and then another knit 5. So it just depends how you want it to look. I'll show you how to do the 2 by 2 rib. So it's simply just knit the first 2 stitches. And then you purl the next 2. And that's why it's a bit easier if you do have an even number of stitches cast on at the start, because then you're always going to be starting, you know, with 2 in pairs of 2. If you have odd number of stitches, you'll have 1 stitch left over, so you'll just have to remember where you are in your rows. And so that's all I've done there, is knit 2, purl 2, and then I'm finishing here with another knit 2. So this time, when I go back, these purl bumps are at the start, so I'm actually going to purl these 2 stitches. So I'm going to go purl, purl, knit, knit, purl, purl, knit, knit. So just take note of where those bumps are and always purl those stitches, and then you won't get lost with where you are in your rib stitch, even if you get interrupted in the middle of a row. So that is the rib stitch. So now that you know a few new stitches, I'd love to see what you plan to make. So let me know in the comments down below, and if you get stuck on anything in your patterns, I'll see if I can give you a hand. If you enjoyed today's video, please give it a like and subscribe to my YouTube channel so you don't miss my future tutorials. If you want to see what I've been making lately, head over to @WoolenWorks on Instagram or Facebook. Thanks for watching and have a great day.